looking forward to our session this evening. Good to see you all. And so just a couple of prefatory comments, and then we'll get right into our study of the last several chapters in Eric Metaxas's book, Letter to the American Church. But I wanted to start off with an article that appeared in one of my favorite sources of information, and that is the Babylon Bee. And this particular article is entitled 9 Reasons Why Christians Should Never Vote. Now, you'll probably want to take notes on this because this is quite profound. And it says the Babylon Bee has put together the following list of reasons why a Christian should never vote. Okay, number 1, separation of church and state. It's in the Constitution, you know. Actually, it's not. But anyway, if Christians are the church, they have to be separated from the state. Okay, so try to refute that logic if you can. Number 2, there is no record in the Bible of Jesus ever voting. And he is our example. Number 3, our home is in heaven, not here. You should never make any effort to make a difference here on earth because we're only here for a while, a short while. Number 4, David French, who we've talked about, David French might call you a Christian nationalist if you vote, okay? Boy, that would be humiliating, wouldn't it? Number 5, voting for a flawed human being will completely destroy your witness. There's actually Christians that believe that, aren't there? Yeah. Number 6, and we'd all want to take note of this, the 15 minutes that you spend voting could have been better spent handing out chick tracts. Okay, chick tracts. Yes, that's kind of outdated. Chick tracts. That was a popular evangelism tract. A series of tracts that was very, very popular back in the 60s, 70s. I don't know if it extended beyond that or not. But anyway, that is a bit outdated. So you can mark that reason off your list, actually. Another reason, you should just be washing the feet of all the people in line to vote. So, you know, it's okay to go on voting on election day, but not to vote, but to wash the feet of those who are voting. And here's another one, which unfortunately really strikes home with many, many Christians. The winners are predestined anyway. So what's the point in even, you know, attempting to make a change for the good? It says God has already divinely chosen which totally depraved wretch will be in power. Okay, so anyway, 9 reasons Christians should never vote, and comes from a very reputable and authoritative source there, the Babylon Bee. Now, there was another article that came to my attention just today, actually, and this is an article, I say it's a bit more serious, and it comes from Decision Magazine, which many of you are familiar with Decision Magazine, and it's entitled, quote, "How did we get here? Christians must end our silence about biblical and moral issues." And I'm not familiar with the author or anything, but there's a few comments he makes in this article that I think were very, very noteworthy. He writes, quote, "People ask me all the time, how did we get to where we are today in our country?" He says, "I believe it's largely the fault of the church because we have been living in our Christian bubbles and ignoring the outside world. Evil has incrementally marched into every area of our culture, our schools, our universities, our media, our government, and we have done nothing about it. For many years, the church has blurred the line between scriptural truth and cultural acceptance. This compromise has diminished our witness. And then he goes on to say later in the article, we need to recognize what is happening. The church today finds itself like a frog in the proverbial hot kettle, not knowing how it got there, but in danger of being boiled and totally losing, any capacity, to affect things for the better. And many Christians are discouraged and wonder how we've ever gotten to this place. I believe we've gotten here by buying into the greatest lie that was ever sold to the church, that for the sake of peace, we shouldn't talk about politics and religion because it's controversial and divisive. I think we would just be absolutely amazed and appalled at how many pastors and so-called church leaders actually believe that we, for the sake of peace, we should not involve ourselves in controversial issues. The author goes on to say, however, you cannot separate politics from the Bible, and he talks about how in the Old Testament and to some extent in the New Testament as well, Christian social responsibility is very much emphasized. Christ's followers were put to death when they wouldn't bow to Caesar or remain silent about Jesus Christ. And rather than affirming that Caesar is Lord, in other words, that government is Lord, and we owe our ultimate allegiance to the government, of course, Christians would very adamantly proclaim that Jesus is Lord. Today, we cannot remain silent just because the world has relabeled some of the vilest views and behavior as, quote, political. They want to convince you that abortion is a political issue, so we shouldn't talk about it. That the LGBTQ agenda and the erosion of the family are political issues, so we shouldn't talk about those either. That the desecration of God's creation of humans as male and female, well, that's also a political issue, so we should not bring that up as well. He goes on to say, but these are not political issues, at least fundamentally they're not. These are moral and biblical issues, and we cannot afford to be silent anymore. We have sat on the sidelines while evil has prospered. And then he talks about some outside influences that are pressing in on the church and the family. And it's precisely what we kind of started this course talking about. I mentioned 4 issues: secularism, which is a godless orientation, socialism, authoritarian government that wants to control most every area of life, sexualism, basically making an idol out of sexuality, and racialism, dividing people along those lines. So he says, here are some factors that are pressing in on the church and family. The first is secular humanism, and he's, absolutely correct about that. The second factor that he identifies is the influence of Marxism. Well, again, socialism generally, at least many theories on socialism have been based on Marxist dogmas and so on. The third influence, he says, is abortion on demand and the LGBTQ agenda, again, sexualism, essentially. And so he ends by saying this, quote, let me warn you, the moment you stand up against what the culture says is acceptable, you will experience conflict. But what the world calls radical Christianity, Jesus calls discipleship. And of course, anyone who tries to encourage Christians to get involved in the great issues of our time is oftentimes dismissed and characterized as a, quote, Christian nationalist. Now, we have to be honest about this. There are Christian nationalists, but again, that term is used very widely and very inexactly, to say the least, to condemn basically anybody, any Christian who believes that we should have any influence in our society and culture at all.
George Washington was a a Christian nationalist, political nationalist. So if Washington can be a nationalist, we're okay, I think.
Well, not in the sense that Christian nationalism wants to impose Christianity as the official national religion and so on. And in that sense, Oren, we remember that the founding fathers were very wise because they had come out of centuries and centuries where either the Roman Catholic Church or some Protestant denomination had been the official state religion, and everybody was taxed, for the support of that particular church. And oftentimes, in fact, it was the norm, those who did not belong to that particular church, whether it was Lutheran or Reformed or Catholic or whatever, were oftentimes very severely discriminated against, if not outright, persecuted. And so the founding fathers, to their great credit, understood that we needed to promote freedom of religion. And that was so revolutionary back then. Now, we think about it, and it hardly registers on our scale, but it was quite radical for back in those days. And they were really in the forefront of religious liberty. A lot to be thankful for. So there are those today who seem to push an agenda trying to impose Christian values and beliefs on mainstream society. And we need to be aware of that, but that's not the agenda that we want to promote. We want to promote liberty and freedom and virtue under the auspices of what we call natural law, natural moral law. And natural law applies to all of humanity, regardless of their religion or whatever. So anyway, we'll talk more about Christian nationalism in a couple of weeks, actually. Well, let's go back and take a look at Letter to the American Church. And I'd like to finish up the last several chapters this evening so we can start fresh and new next week. So last week, in our study, we covered chapters 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And you see there, if you're following along in your study outline, that chapter 5 was the chapter in which he talked about 12,000 pastors. And you might recall that it was estimated at the time in the 1930s in Germany, there were about 18,000 Protestant pastors. Overwhelmingly, they were Lutheran, but there were some other denominations as well. And that of those 18,000, when the Nazis seize power and Hitler begins to manifest his agenda, those Christian leaders basically break down into three categories. There were those who actively supported the Nazi agenda as very, very proud German patriots and nationalists, by the way. And that was about 3,000, roughly, of the 18,000. Another group actively resisted the government's agenda, and that was about 3,000 as well. So together, that's 6,000 out of the 18,000. Now, what about the other 12,000? Well, that's the group that Metaxas wants to focus on, not the ones that were ardent Nazis and not the ones who opposed the Nazi agenda, but the other 12,000 who basically just very passively complied with the state, agenda and so on, put up no resistance whatsoever. In other words, they were culture war pacifists. And he believes, Metaxas believes, that they share so much of the responsibility and the guilt for what happened in the 1930s and beyond. So he writes in this chapter about the problem of culture war pacifism. He says the mentality of this 12,000 was, look, we're just called to preach the gospel. And we don't want to get engaged in controversial issues because controversial issues are divisive. And so, we want to stay as ignorant as possible when it comes to social and political issues and not, corrupt our ministry through involvement in those sorts of affairs. So the culture war pacifists. Now, that's basically chapter 5. We talked a little bit about that last week. Chapter 6, the spiral of silence. And Metaxas will very sharply critique culture war pacifism in this chapter 6. And he makes comments such as, quote, just as cowardice begets cowardice, courage begets courage. When we speak out, we inevitably encourage others to speak out. So in other words, either we are assisting evil or we are fighting evil. And yet in so many churches, and this would apply primarily, of course, Metaxas's primary focus here in this book is not on liberal Christianity, liberal Protestantism, so-called progressive Protestantism, because he understands, as did John Gresham Machen and others, that so-called progressive Christianity is not Christianity at all. It's another religion. So what he's focusing on is, are these evangelicals or self-proclaimed evangelicals who refuse to get involved in the great issues of our day. And he calls it the evangelical idol of evangelism. In other words, they believe that we're only here in order to practice evangelism and not to be full, not to embrace full Christian discipleship that extends into every area of our life. Now, chapter 7 is entitled, as you see there in your notes, Two Errors of Faith. And this is a chapter in which he really focuses in on what Bonhoeffer called cheap grace. Modern evangelicalism, he said, often reduces Christian discipleship to just personal piety. In other words, my personal prayer life, obviously, my family responsibilities, church, and so on. But beyond that, apparently, many believe that our Christian faith doesn't really apply to any real extent to the great issues, in our culture and society. And so that's basically the point he's making there in chapter 7. And then in chapter 8, it's entitled The Church Paralyzed, and he talks about what true faith really incorporates. Belief in God, Metaxas says, is more than intellectual assent. In other words, just believing that there was a historical Jesus and believing that, he was the incarnate Son of God and our Savior and so on. And recognizing that we're sinners who need salvation grace. But again, beyond that, we can pretty much live our lives as we feel led to do. And so he'll say in this chapter that belief in God is more than intellectual assent. It requires that we trust God and live to serve him wholeheartedly and in every area of life. And then chapter 9 was the idol of evangelism. And oh my, I can't imagine what most evangelicals, including pastors, would think if they were browsing through this book, Letter to the American Church, and they came across a chapter called The Idol of Evangelism. They'd really freak out, I do believe. But again, what he's doing in this chapter is emphasizing that true Christian conversion is holistic. It's comprehensive discipleship, and should impact how we think and how we live, how we function in every area of life. He says Christians are called to fight, for instance, we're called to fight for justice in every area of life. But too many Christian leaders today are fearful of confronting evil. They refuse to address anything or say anything that's, quote, controversial, judgmental, or political for fear that it will offend others. And so very, very powerful chapter there. And we covered that last week. Now, this evening, we're going to, also last week, I'm sorry, we also spoke about chapter 10, speaking the truth in love, as we're enjoined to do in Scripture. And we need to stand unequivocally for the truth of the Christian faith and how it applies to all areas of life. But we also understand that how we communicate in some respects can be as important or more so than what we're trying to communicate. And so we all understand that we are, sinners saved by God's grace. There is no room for arrogance as Christians. And we understand that we're called to serve others and to treat them, with loving respect. Nonetheless, we should stand unequivocally for the truth. And so he, in that chapter, by the way, he addresses issues such as the sexual trends of the last 50 years, the transgender madness, as he calls it, abortion, and so on. He refers to abortion as being a grave sin. So chapter 10. All right, so beginning with chapter 11, we're sort of breaking new ground this evening, so we'll go through this a little more, these chapters a little more methodically than anything we've covered up to this point. Any questions or comments? I see there's one thing that's come up in the chat line. This is from our friend Dan Siegel. Hey everybody, Dan Siegel here, zooming in tonight. Had a bit of car trouble, but I hope to see you all next week. So thank you, Dan, for the notification. Sorry about your car issues. Dan's employment is delivering auto parts, and so he's very dependent upon the automobile technology and so on.
Jeffrey?
Yes.
You're finished.
I am. Let me try to get out of this. Okay, please.
In Acts 20:27, when Paul is in Ephesus, he says he was glad, well, that's probably my term, but that he didn't shrink from preaching the whole gospel, the whole counsel of God. He didn't say the whole gospel. He said the whole counsel, which is something that I think shows you there's a much broader message than just what we have narrowly defined as the evangelical message of justice, Matthew 28 kind of thing.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
And that's really, I think, where the true measure of the current church has failed.
Yeah, I'd never thought of that particular passage in this context. Yeah. It's a good point. Yeah. And think about it. Jesus had a very productive ministry for somewhere around 3 years, something maybe even 3.5 years. Yet you can read everything in the 4 Gospels that Jesus says. You can go through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, read everything that's recorded that he said, and you could probably read it all in a couple of hours. Obviously, Jesus taught an enormous amount more than just the little bit that we encounter in the 4 Gospels. Yet, of course, what we do encounter in the 4 Gospels is absolutely the essence of his ministry and message and so on. But undoubtedly, he addressed, the full range of life issues as well. Yeah. Thanks, Chuck. Sure. All right, so chapter 11, be ye not political. Okay. This is the tacit message that many people imbibe in their evangelical church. And yet Metaxas in this chapter is going to argue that the church is the last bastion of justice, decency, and civility. A lot of you in your work environment, you could certainly attest to this. the church as being the last bastion of justice, decency, and civility. And he addresses right off the great lie that Christians should be apolitical or above politics. And yet we've come back to this theme repeatedly, in our weeks together. And that is that politics affects so many areas of people's lives. And if you truly love another person, you have to be concerned about the political, social environment in which they're having to live. Now, he quotes Romans 13, 1-7, which is the famous passage in which the Apostle Paul writes, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities." Also, of course, 1 Peter 2, 13-17, in which Peter emphasizes, "Submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every authority," and so on. And yet we know in the New Testament, there's more to our social responsibility and our civic responsibility than just being in submission. We'll address that a little bit later. There's nothing righteous, there's nothing noble, there's nothing admirable about being socially and politically ignorant, uninformed, uninvolved. Not at all. I mean, we are so privileged to live in the United States of America, the greatest nation in all of world history. And with that great advantage and privilege comes great responsibilities as well. Responsibilities and privileges that people in the first century, of course, would never have even imagined was ever going to be possible in human history. Now, looking at Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Germany, Metaxas argues that most Lutheran Christians and church leaders inherited their political pacifism from the writings of Martin Luther. And he goes on to talk a little bit about the life and times of Luther and some of the political uproar and so on that was going on during Luther's life, and how Luther emphasized obeying the authorities, the governmental authorities. But having said that, Luther also was very adamant that the local government authorities be Lutherans, okay, be Protestants, not Roman Catholics. And so, finally having achieved an area there in Germany that was no longer Roman Catholic, Martin Luther emphasizes obeying the proper authorities, again, provided they were Lutheran Christians. So anyway, he discusses that in the chapter, and I think you'd enjoy reading some of those pages in the chapter. But then he transitions to Germany in the 1930s under Hitler. And he makes the comment that when Hitler came to power in the early 1930s, German Christians largely submitted to the authority of the Nazis, just as they had the previous governments. And they'd had some pretty rotten governments in the past, but of course the Nazis are going to exceed the decadence of any previous government. But it's important to note in this context about being loyal, obedient servants of the state, that in cases where government and religious officials order Christians to violate our conscience and also violate the moral laws of God, then Scripture is perfectly clear that Christians must always obey God rather than man, obey God rather than the government. And that's something that too often has been, omitted, certainly in the teachings of Luther and so on, and other Christian leaders since. We cannot submit to anything that directly violates the laws of God. So the church, he says, has a responsibility. It has a responsibility to strenuously oppose immoral laws, unjust laws, and unnatural laws. A good example would be state support and endorsement of abortion on demand. You probably read just today or yesterday that some judge in Fulton County had declared that the abortion legislation passed, what was it, a couple of years ago here in Georgia, was null and void, because in his opinion, it violates constitutional law. It, of course, hopefully will be his decision, hopefully will be overturned very quickly, but we can't go along with legislation like that, or with court edicts like that. Also think about when it comes to opposing immoral, unjust, unnatural laws, think about how marriage has been redefined. And Metaxas puts it this way: has your pastor spoken out on these issues so that those in the congregation and beyond know that he is not silently assenting to the sweeping changes being proposed? Speaking the truth of God for his purposes is simply our duty. That is basic Christianity. So no, we're not obligated to go along with anything and everything that government officials, declare is proper and all. Now, he talks about how that in his day, Dietrich Bonhoeffer urged the church to step up and function as the conscience of the state, the conscience of the state. And, we go back to that quote that I've referred to several times in this course and in other courses as well, the quote from R.C. Sproul, where Sproul is basically saying that never in all of Christian history has a church been so ineffectual in having a social and cultural impact on their nation as the church today in America, the freest church in all of human history, and yet in many respects doing the least good. So he talks about how that, again, Bonhoeffer urges the church to step up, function as the conscience of the state. And Bonhoeffer became so frustrated with the lack of moral courage on the part of church leaders that he joined the underground anti-Nazi resistance movement. And he was criticized oftentimes by those who were aware of what he was doing during the war. And Metaxas asked the question, did the conspiracy to assassinate Adolf Hitler violate the biblical principle, thou shalt not kill? And of course, did it violate one of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not kill? No, not at all, because that commandment is talking about the taking of innocent life. It's talking about thou shalt not murder. And in that sense, plotting to assassinate this evil, wicked Adolf Hitler was not murder. It was not taking innocent life. In fact, it was just the opposite. Hitler and the Nazi agenda were absolutely evil, and they were anything but innocent. So, being involved in this plot, I don't see anything morally objectionable. In fact, I believe it was compelled by his moral sensibilities. Similarly, he says, many of the most courageous opponents of the radical neo-Marxist agenda in America today are not necessarily Christians. Some of the most courageous people in our society and culture are not Christians. He says, these are people who despise and resent, for instance, big government, neo-Marxists, who support more government regulations and control over traditional civil liberties, including freedom of expression and freedom of religion. Also, the very rule of law. I mean, look how the rule of law has been just totally ignored on the southern border, which, having well-defined and regulated borders is integral to national sovereignty. And yet the rule of law in that respect and many other respects has just been totally ignored, especially in the last 4 years. Now, what about this issue of civil liberties such as freedom of expression? Did you hear the comment by John Kerry, former, what was he, Secretary of State or something? Did you hear what he had to say about
Which one?
freedom of expression?
Right, the First Amendment is actually a real threat. To
Yes.
what's accomplishing what we got to do.
Yeah.
Bill Gates made a similar comment at that forum as well.
Bill Gates has also said something similar to that? Okay.
But John Kerry made another appointment comment that discussing the Ukrainian war and how successful it is, and that we shouldn't really worry about it because we're not killing U.S. soldiers, it's only Ukrainian soldiers, so it doesn't matter.
Okay. Now that's rather selective morality.
There's
to
a
say the least.
list of Kerry-isms.
Yeah. Yeah, not exactly a great moral thinker. Never
Right.
has been. Okay. Also, what about how we look at the utterly despicable abortion industry? What about the radical and immoral sexual agenda of the LGBTQ lobby? What about those who call for liberalizing or eliminating traditional drug laws? I mean, just think of how, drug abuse and so on, the widespread ramifications of that have been in our society and culture, of course, for many, many decades. But now I understand even marijuana is far more potent than it was back in the 60s, for instance. What about those who call for liberalizing or eliminating restrictions on pornography? What about the racist agenda of critical race theory and the Black Lives Matter movements? Just expressly Marxist, racist movement. What about the dishonest collusion between big tech, capitalist pigs, and neo-Marxist forces in government and business? What about the dishonest media that refuses to accurately and honestly report the news? We'll probably see examples of that tonight in the debate, the so-called debate. Okay, the bias, media bias. What about all the left-wing propaganda and indoctrination that passes for education? And what about the collusion between Big Pharma and the AMA to spread disinformation and censor those who challenge official positions on infectious diseases and other health crises? So all these are matters, of concern. And it's part of our Christian social responsibilities, if you want to look at it that way, to be very informed and very actively involved. And that would include, politically keeping the very worst people out of office. Now, chapter 12 is entitled, Who Do You Say God Is? And his question in this chapter, and he doesn't go into it to any real extent, is what is God asking you to do? What is God asking each of us to do? We have a, spiritual, moral responsibility to be a source of light and love and salt and hope and truth and so on. He says, are we committed to pleasing God? Or are we all about self-promotion, playing it safe, seeking the approbation of others? Metaxas puts it this way: to love unreservedly, which is God's calling for us, is to risk everything, including our lives if necessary, and our reputations. Chapter 13, the parable of the talents. And basically, he's arguing in this chapter, again, it's not a real substantive chapter, but he's talking about there is no middle road, no safe road. Jesus is saying that you either know him and love him and trust him, or else you do not. Whose side are you on? We have only two choices. There's no middle ground. We either stand in the freedom wherewith Christ has set us free, or we stand with Satan. So that's basically the theme there. of chapter 13. Let me just pause though. Any questions or comments, anything before we continue on?
I really wish he spent more time on the chapter.
You wish I had?
No, I wish
Or-
he had.
Oh, okay. What in particular do you see as being?
Well, basically, what is the demand, and how shall we then live? To really answer that question, to give particulars to it. So,
I have a comment, Jeffrey.
Yes, Oren.
What you're describing and we're seeing approaching is sort of parallel to the Revolutionary War period, and that's the word tyranny. And there are two words that from that era, tyranny and liberty, that have always stood out to me. And here we are in the same boat, sort of discussing and describing the tyranny of the dark side, and what are we going to do about it, and how are we going to go about it. But in this case, the pulpits are silent, whereas in Washington's time they were not. So
Yeah,
it's
right.
quite a contrast. So
Yes,
it makes it more worrisome.
yes, you're absolutely correct about that. There were a lot of very courageous church leaders back at that time who were risking a lot,
Yeah.
not just their reputations, but their lives in opposing the British in that war. Yeah. Well said. Yes, Mike?
Yeah, you were making a comment about the binary choice between Satan and Jesus. And I think today the issue of abortion politically is a real quagmire, because abortion at any stage is evil. So what we're doing now is to narrow it down 15 weeks, 12 weeks, 6 weeks, and we're voting for the evil. And so it's not a binary choice. It's almost like, less evil, the lesser.
Yeah.
And it's a difficult situation.
You're absolutely right. So let me pose this question to you. Many would hold the position that politics is the art of the possible. So that requires an awful lot of compromise, doesn't it? If that were true, those who stand absolutely for certain moral principles are certainly not going to be elected, are they?
Right.
So what's your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts, I think there's some practicality with politics. I mean, there's two stances. You can say, well, if it's evil, it stands against God. God's all supreme and powerful. He can stop it if he wants. And so, damn the torpedo, full steam ahead. But I personally think that, in my mind, I think God is powerful, but we need to be practical too at some point.
Yeah.
And say the different shades of evil, but.
Well, regrettably, I agree with you.
Yeah.
And I do mean regrettably, because again, if politics is the art of possible, and in our system, you have to get elected to do anything. And so it's a real moral conundrum, because if you're out of power politically, you're not going to be able to accomplish anything. So that's where many Christians and also, conservative politicians have taken this position. Look, let's do as much good as possible under the circumstances. And when you consider the realities of human nature and how flawed we are as human beings, perhaps that is the bottom line, and that is, let's contain as much evil as possible. and let's support those who obviously are going to promote more that's good and just and decent than others. And apparently, all human institutions are flawed, and perhaps that's the best option available.
On the other hand, I think we need to continue to hold that anything after conception is life.
Yeah.
Okay, and hold that true, and what you said, then hold that also necessary, maybe
Yes.
not the best.
Yes. Yeah. Well, again, that's a fundamental Christian value and belief, and that is that life is sacred from conception on. A lot of people, I would assume most people, don't agree with that. So how do we accomplish the most good possible, given the fact that probably most Americans do not believe that life is sacred from conception, and yet many are very, very uncomfortable with late-term abortions or abortions after 15 weeks or whatever. So how do we in good conscience as Christians navigate this, again, as I said, moral conundrum?
We have to be the feet.
We have to
be the feet. We have to spread the gospel. Because if people have Jesus in their heart, they're not going to want to get it.
well, you're right, they're going to,
So that's the root, is have the gospel spread across the world.
and whether they've been explicitly taught it or not, eventually they're going to come to the realization that, yes, life is sacred from conception. Yes. Karen?
Well, I was just thinking, kind of, you said conundrum. Remember when I told you a while back that the pregnancy center where I was on, they were saying that since that law passed, that 6 weeks.
Yes, the 6-week
Yeah, they were saying
ban.
that they were experiencing more women, the number was rising for the women who were having abortions because they felt pressure, but it's kind of like, you don't want to, but as Christ followers, I don't think we can say, well, because that's happening, we should up it and say, let's make it 12 weeks. I don't feel right doing that. But isn't that horrible? So now we're trying to prevent it, but now at least in that their experience, now it was rising.
It's a very uncomfortable compromise, isn't it? And yet we understand that that's better than the idea that is being pushed increasingly, and that is abortion is permissible all the way up to the time of birth. And there are those, of course, including some very influential people, who believe that parents should have the option for infanticide, even for several weeks after birth, to make sure this little creature is exactly what you were looking for, okay? Like, oh, well, I was hoping for a blue-eyed child, and this one has brown eyes, so let's try again, okay? So we live in a very, very flawed world, and a lot of these are not easy issues moral issues to navigate, are they? Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on then, so we can finish as much as possible. Excuse me, sign my check here. Thank you. All right, chapter 14 is entitled Justifying Ourselves, distinguishing between the moral and the moralistic. And in this chapter, Metaxas is talking about how Christians are called to trust God wholeheartedly in this life, not to duck and cover in an attempt to play it safe. In Bonhoeffer's time, many in the church took the safe path, the path of least resistance. As human beings, we tend to do that, don't we? But they feared challenging the government, using as their cover the passage in Romans 13, on obeying the dictates of the state. Bonhoeffer, on the other hand, stood resolutely for the cause of goodness and justice, in other words, for the cause of Christ, in opposition to the government's agenda. Of course, he knew this was one of the most evil governments in all of human history. So the question is, why do so many Christians and church leaders avoid controversial issues? They fear mixing Christianity and what they call politics under the guise of just preaching the gospel. But in reality, according to Metaxas, it's mostly about self-preservation. They don't want to ruin their career in the pastorate, in the ministry, or whatever. So they compromise accordingly. So for example, now again, you see that a subtext of this chapter is distinguishing between what's right, the moral, from the moralistic. And when you add that suffix to a word, it oftentimes radically changes the meaning of the word. For instance, we all should think and live rationally, shouldn't we? Rationally, not irrationally. But rationalism means, rationalism is basically a philosophy of life that people adopt who don't believe in God. And they believe that all we have to guide us through life is our own brain. There are no absolute standards or absolute principles of right and wrong. And so the rationalistic would say, I don't care what the Bible says or some old religious book, I've got a brain. And so I'm going to live my life according to how I think. So again, that suffix ISM or ISTIC oftentimes makes all the difference. So here's the question. What do you do when a Gestapo agent comes banging on your door and you are sheltering a Jew inside your house or in your basement? Now the agent demands, are you hiding a Jew in your home? It's been reported that you're hiding a Jew in your home. Now here's the moment of truth. Does the person lie to the agent, knowing full well that it's a sin not to tell the truth? Furthermore, this agent who's come and demanded, are you hiding a Jew? He's an official of the government, and aren't you supposed to obey the government? See? However, if he admits that a Jew is hiding in his house, then he's sending an innocent man to his death. So what's the right thing to do?
Well, that's Rahab.
Yeah, that's very true. That's,
she had to answer that question herself.
yeah. And how is she characterized in script? Well, when the spies first encounter her, she's referred to as the harlot, the prostitute Rahab. Okay, and yet she has this innate God-given moral sense that certain things are intrinsically right and wrong. Very thing that we refer to when we talk about natural moral law, and what the Apostle Paul writes about, in Romans 1 and 2. And so she does the right thing. She lies to the local officials in order to save the lives of these Jewish spies, Israeli spies. So obviously the right thing, the moral thing would be to lie and therefore save an innocent person's life. So that's all the difference in being moral and being moralistic. And as an example, I used Rahab in my notes here, who lied to Jericho officials so as to protect the Hebrew spies. So an important distinction to keep in mind. Now that doesn't give us carte blanche, space to just lie anytime it suits our agenda. Obviously, we're talking about great moral principles, great moral actions going on here.
Is that the same when Abraham lied and said Sarah?
Yes, yeah, I'd say so. That didn't work out though well, did it? As she was violated sexually as a result. Yeah.
Abraham's wife Sarah was violated sexually.
Wasn't she?
Oh, I didn't know
No,
that.
that was not the
I
case.
thought God protected.
No, he didn't. But he wanted, the guy wanted to marry her in the harem, but did not.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
She was not, she did not.
Okay, good.
No,
I'd
no.
I'd forgotten the
Actually,
details
the
on that.
harem guy
Okay.
was more moral at that point than Abraham, because why didn't you tell me? I wouldn't have taken her if you told me she was your wife.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's right. I'm sorry. I'd forgotten the details on that.
Abraham
But that
that
implies that he violated her sexually.
Right. I think that, well,
doesn't say that.
It
Matter of
doesn't
fact,
say it, but it's implied.
Is it? Maybe
think
that's
if you-
where I
I-
sort of
Depends
got
how
that.
you read it.
Okay. All right.
I don't see that in the case
I don't either.
at all.
I don't either.
I don't see that applied at all. Matter of fact, the person who's punished by God is not Abraham. It's actually the person who was actually trying to take his
Okay.
life away.
Okay.
So the real question is, where did Abraham sin? If
Mhm.
God punished the other person?
but he did lie.
He was trying to protect himself.
So I'm asking you, the question is, if Abraham was the one who sinned, then why was the ruler punished?
Oh, I thought he was
I
wanting
don't
to
think
save
the ruler
Sarah.
was punished. Didn't he gave Abraham a lot of,
Right, he paid the
money
price.
and
Tell him to get out of
the
here.
herds and said, leave.
Get out.
Exactly, so he paid a penalty. He paid a price.
True, but I think Abraham liked to protect himself.
Okay,
Well,
then go
that's-
into the two other
He said-
categories.
Yeah.
Well,
Go into
that
two other categories as well.
that will be our next
Anyway,
course.
sorry.
We're going to make that
So
the
why would he represent?
topic of for our next course. What's that?
Save his life.
Yeah, right. Okay. Well, we better get back to the topic at hand here so we can finish. So let's take a look at chapter 15,
By the way,
which is religionless Christianity. And so, by the way, Metaxas's follow-up book to Letter to the American Church was called just that, religionless Christianity. And it's a term that he used late in his career, and it was roundly misunderstood, especially by liberal theologians, what Bonhoeffer was talking about. But in the last months of his life, in a series of letters to a good friend of his, Eberhard Bethge, in which Bethge later published under the title Letters and Papers from Prison, Bonhoeffer reassessed the value of conventional institutionalized Christianity. He's questioning the value of conventional institutionalized Christianity. In one letter in particular, Bonhoeffer wrote of the need for, quote, religionless Christianity. Now, in the aftermath of World War II, there were these liberal Protestants who misinterpreted Bonhoeffer's message to imply that he had drifted away from the Orthodox Christian faith toward a kind of ecumenical interfaith orientation. But that's apparently not the case at all. In reality, what Bonhoeffer was really meaning when he used that term, religionless Christianity, was that what was needed for the faith was a deeper rather than a superficial religion. And Metaxas puts it this way, quote, Bonhoeffer saw it was the dead religion of German Lutheranism, that traditional state religion in the country, that had failed to stand against the unprecedented evil of the Nazis. He knew that the days of mere church attendance and intellectual assent to various doctrines were the culprits, that they were what had allowed the unprecedented evils of that time to flourish. The dead religion of many churches in Germany had shown itself not only to be flimsy and useless, but to be piously playing the part assigned to it by the devil himself. The Christianity in quotes, so-called Christianity of the German churches had been dead religion masquerading as Christianity. We've got a lot of that in America, don't we? And in succumbing to it, those churches had become nothing less than the handmaidens of evil. So he's saying, look, using this term religionless Christianity, he's talking about basically what we might call religiosity or something, and for various reasons, sometimes just social reasons, people continue to go to church and whatever, and go through the motions and sing along with the hymns and repeat, the traditional creeds and so on, but they've never turned their heart over to Christ, and they've never been truly converted in the full sense. So the application to the current American evangelical church, according to Metaxas, is simply this: will we shed, he says, the facade of superficial religiosity and self-centered pietism and stand for truth against the great evils of our day? Or are we just kind of playing church, and involved in church for a variety of reasons? For some people, they find nice people, nice friends at church. And for some, it works as a support group of sorts and so on. But all of those are more me-centered and superficial reasons. So what is our true motivation? Will we recover, he says, the radical countercultural orientation and commitment of true Christianity? And will we be a true source of light and love and hope and truth in the midst of this very decadent society and culture? And as the New Testament is very, very clear, true Christianity is countercultural by its very nature. Now, that term countercultural, of course, was kind of co-opted back in the 60s by the hippie movement and so on. And there's always been a lot of countercultural movements. But true Christianity should be countercultural. We should have markedly different values and agendas in life than the world, the non-Christian world has. Metaxas writes, quote, "We've come to that place in history now, and the Lord looks to us, the American church. Will we be his people now as the world looks to us in the midst of all the madness going on?" Just think about what went on today, talking about the madness, the Iranian missile barrage launched at Israel. Our Bible studies and our sermons have all been meaningless if we do not make what we learned come alive in ways that are self-sacrificial. This is the hour for which each of us has been born. We must live wholeheartedly, unreservedly, and fearlessly for Christ. And again, Metaxas puts it, quote, so you who are the church, for it is not an institution. The church is not an institution. It's a collection of each of us in direct personal relationship to God. We are responsible in this. God looks to you now and to you alone. He has put history and the future in your hands. So in the end, you cannot look to your pastor or church leaders. You need to look to God himself. He created you for a relationship with himself. And although he wishes to use your pastors and leaders in helping you along the journey, he cannot do so unless you yourself take the ultimate responsibility. Are you willing? Are you ready? God has chosen each of us to live now at this very moment in history for his eternal purposes. We are not here by some mistake. We're not just, mindless flukes of the universe. Each one of us is an intentional being in the created in the image of God. God has ordained that we be born when we were born and that we live right now to do the works now that he has prepared for us in advance, all for his glory. It's unimaginable. It's an unimaginable privilege. This is the hour of the American church. Well, look, we know that since World War II and all the death and destruction of World War II, there has really only been one nation in the entire world that had the power to affect world affairs positively, and that's been the United States of America. And look at the abysmal leadership we have, and the fact that we've largely just totally failed in that respect to be a moral leader in the world. Now, there's other great nations, great not meaning good, but great powerful nations in the world that can certainly affect world affairs in a negative sense. China, obviously, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and so on. But when it comes to affecting world affairs in a positive sense, having any kind of positive influence on world affairs, it's only the United States. We're the only ones that have that power. And you see how it's been so squandered in the last, well, frankly, for decades. But especially, of course, it's worse now than it's actually ever been. So he says, he closes the chapter, this is the hour of the American church. By God's providential grace, what is it, about 4 or 5%? 4 or 5% of the people in the world are privileged to live in the United States. And we are in that tiny little minority, 4 or 5%. So we need to understand we're here for a purpose and take it very, very seriously, or we're going to be judged very, very severely. Now, the last chapter in the book is called The Final Push, and subtitle is On Earth as It Is in Heaven. And he starts off talking about Ronald Reagan in 1987, standing in front of the Berlin Wall and his famous challenge, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And he talks about how evil regimes build walls to keep people incarcerated so they can't leave the country. And this is how totalitarian states operate. Metaxas mentions that Ronald Reagan seemed to know that because the Soviet Union was built on a lie, it was unsustainable and could be brought down if somebody had the courage to stand and fight against it. And, he was far from an ideal, perfect president, but he did provide some necessary leadership in a lot of areas of life, including his opposition to the tyranny of the Soviet Union. And he does that despite disapproval from some of his establishment top advisors, people like Henry Kissinger, people like the Chief of Staff, Howard Baker, people like General Colin Powell, for instance. Reagan had the courage and he had the conviction to publicly confront the Soviet evil empire, as he called it, correctly called it. Metaxas writes, quote, "This is one of the hallmarks of true leadership. Perhaps like Bonhoeffer, Reagan understood that he had to be concerned only with an audience of one, and that one is God Almighty himself. Establishment figures like Kissinger, like Howard Baker, like Colin Powell, like so many Republicans today, and so many in the American church today, were in fact comfortable with their status quo positions and influence and prestige that they enjoyed. This was true also in the days of Bonhoeffer. It was also true in the days of William Wilberforce and others who've dedicated their lives to confronting evil. Due to Reagan's courageous words and actions, along with those of people like Margaret Thatcher and who else?
Churchill.
Yeah, Pope John Paul II. Yeah. In time, he says, the whole Berlin Wall and then the so-called Iron Curtain would come down. The vast 7 decades old Soviet empire would eventually collapse. In 1989, the Berlin Wall was toppled, and 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself was dissolved. It's one of the greatest miracles in history. And when you go back and look at the details, it does seem to be inexplicable, other than an amazing miracle that the Soviet Union just all of a sudden crumbled and disintegrated. I mean, there was no violent revolution that overthrew the communists or anything like that. I mean,
I've got a comment on that, Jeffrey.
yes, or
There was a group of free enterprise institute called the all of a sudden it's gone, but the Austrian School of Economics.
oh yes,
And there were books that were written, very prestigious, Friedrich Hayek. They predicted that the old USSR would collapse because their economy did not have a profit system, and therefore they didn't know what to manufacture. Bureaucrats were deciding what to manufacture, not demand from the customers, which reflects the profit margins. And so they all those kinds of systems over and over again, they failed, and because their economic system is not consistent with human action,
yes,
and there's no profit in there, and they're inefficient. So you have China there, struggling, and
yeah.
anyway, that's a big part of it, with their economy and the lack of a profit system. It lasts so long, and then they run out of assets. They run out of the people's money, and Reagan pushed them in the military area, the Star Wars program. So that was one of the primary reasons, was their lack of a profit in their economic system.
Well, it's a system based, it was not based on the realities of human nature.
Yeah, right.
And any system that is based accordingly, is bound to disintegrate, corruption.
Sooner or later, yeah. And so you have China here now. Here they are. You see, they're struggling because they've artificially kept it going by building all these apartments and things where there was no demand for those apartments, but it looked good on their economic growth. And
Sounds
now
like,
they're horrendously in debt.
vehicles, yeah.
And
Sounds
they're
like electric vehicles that our government's been pushing.
yeah,
for 2 or 3
but
years.
they're really in deep yogurt, and they got to have the rest of the world to help them stay alive. Otherwise,
Yeah.
so,
And that's something that we, again, very much are thankful for when it comes to the so-called founding fathers of America. And that is, these are people who wanted to maximize liberty as much as was in keeping with human nature. And that's why they constantly want to link liberty and virtue. And they understand that without virtue, liberty, is
that's it, right?
very quickly degenerate into.
But they had the biblical point of view. They recognized the weaknesses of man and their sin nature, and they knew that the government they formed had to reflect a guard against the sin nature of man, and that's therefore the division of power was their approach to.
Yes.
Hopefully, but they had doubts, and here we are today with the Democrats wanting to do some things to the Supreme Court, which was one of the 3 branches of that separation. And
well,
anyway, here we are. And we have to ask ourselves, as this tyranny, if it were to grow and grow more severe, are we going to us Christians, come to the day when we get dragged off to the Coliseum that's been built in Washington, D.C., and get fed to the lions, and that sort of thing? That's that's really not impossible because man is so depraved. They've
Yeah.
done it once. We see the thing that's going on now with abortion. I
Right.
mean, that's depravity in its ultimate. So
Right.
we
Yeah.
all have to
Any
decide
system has to
at what point are we
compatible with
going
the
to
realities of human
say
nature.
no more and not take any more. I've thought about that and decided that when they come in my house to take someone I'm helping, and they come to take those people, that's the day I'm going to die, because I'm not going to let them come in.
Well,
So that's something we all have to think about. But hopefully, we just keep praying to God that none of that happens,
we need
and
to
that
pray
people
for
wake up.
God's mercy, don't we?
And
And
and we get a new school system where the people learn enough to become a discerning electorate, that they know how to vote properly,
yeah.
and not be subject to the propaganda that they get from the left. But that requires
Yeah.
proper
The system has
education.
to take into consideration the reality of human nature.
Yeah,
And
I'm
going back to my favorite source of information these days, the Babylon Bee, being facetious, obviously, but there was an article 3 or 4 weeks ago in the Babylon Bee. It was somehow they gained access to an interview with George Washington in heaven. And the title of the article was, yeah, America had a pretty good run, didn't it? And Washington was commenting that, America's lasted for about 250 years, and that by world civilization standards, that's a pretty long run and an awful lot to be thankful for. But we hope and pray that it continues, but the signs are not encouraging. Mike, yes.
Just a theoretical question that I've wondered for some time. There was a man, young man, his first name was Paul. I don't know what his second name or the last name was, but he was the son of some people that we were in church with together that we no longer are. But he's the one that went down to Florida and actually shot the abortion doctor as he was going into his office to commit the abortions that day. And he was caught, he admitted it, he was tried, he was executed because he wanted to be executed. And he wanted to be executed for what he did. How do you feel that Eric Metaxas would handle that?
I would recommend asking Eric Metaxas. Mike, if you would write that in a email to me,
Okay.
I'll send it off. And
Is this like the Babylon Bee, or are you?
No, I'm serious. No, I'll send it off, and I think we could get it to Eric Metaxas. Yeah.
Jeffrey, this is
Yeah.
Gail.
Yes, Gail.
The question that arose when you ask us what to do when the Gestapo comes to the door of one's home who's hiding a Jew, it was a heavy burden on me to decide what was my Christian responsibility to hide that Jew in the first place? And to me, that's the greater weight than even how I respond when they come to the door. There's no doubt about how I'm going to respond. That's minute compared to me helping to save that Jew.
Okay.
And I feel a heavy burden to step out when anyone is selected.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
No,
I think it might come to that. And that's, I think, what they're just saying. We haven't looked at it exactly like that.
mm-hmm.
You'll be dead
There is,
too.
by the way, there's a brilliant movie that came out just 2 or 3 years ago. And on our way to England, we watched this on the airplane. And I believe the title is simply it has the name Irena, Irena, in the title, and it's about a woman who took in Jewish refugees during World War II. She was Polish, and it's just a very, very inspiring, great movie with a lot of very deep insights into our moral responsibilities.
That's how I thought that was the moral issue of that. It was
Yeah.
overpowering for me. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Gail.
Well, just a quick comment, I'm sorry, one that, you said the movie's name last week is Irena's Vow.
Irena's
Yeah.
Vow, VOW, Irena's Vow. Thank you, Donna.
But,
Yeah.
well, and my thought though too, just very quick, in today's culture, I think we're gonna be the Jews that are being hidden in the basement.
Well, that's a possibility.
More likely that,
A lot
I mean, we're the ones,
In the future.
right?
A lot of
Mhm.
Christians have come under persecution. The football coach from the state of Washington,
Yes.
the bakers that are
Yes.
making the cakes, the
Mhm.
florists
Mhm.
who
Yeah.
refuse to
Right.
provide arrangements or bake cakes for ceremonies that go against their religious
We may have
beliefs.
both questions. We have both scenarios.
There's been a lot of persecution. Then people who protest outside of abortion clinics. Oh my gosh, the FACE Act.
Mhm.
Yes.
They're putting them all in jail under the FACE Act.
Mhm. And yet, going back to 2020, and since then, rioters and people that just wreaked havoc.
Nothing.
Well, nothing.
Oftentimes, no repercussions whatsoever. Yeah. Well, we need to finish up because the debate is coming on in a little over 30 minutes. So we've got about 3 minutes to finish up, and a few more comments here before we leave it off for this evening. We last were talking in this chapter about Ronald Reagan and challenging the evil empire of the Soviet Union and so on. And Metaxas makes the point that the cultural Marxism, the neo-Marxism, cultural Marxism, the woke agenda that we face today is far more insidious than the blatant evil of the communist Soviet Union. I mean, everybody in Russia that had even a modicum of moral sense knew that their government was wretched and evil. But the cultural Marxism that we are experiencing today is, he says, even more insidious.
Mhm.
It's an anti-God propaganda that accuses America of being one of the worst countries in all of human history. And so, in summary, Eric Metaxas will encourage us to be courageous, but not reckless. Be courageous, but be wise. He says God is calling us, clearly calling us, but he cannot and will not force us to do what's right. We do have free will. We do have human agency within the parameters of human nature. He says, heaven looks to you and to me to do the right thing, but are you willing to speak out in a situation where others are being silent? Are you to risk your job? Or if you're a church leader, are you to risk your congregation? God is good, but his goodness is not safe and it's not tame. He does not call us to be tame or safe or religious. When we follow him in this way, we are certain to be misunderstood by those who cling to their safe pieties and worldly wisdom. And again, this can come in church, the establishment, both in politics and in religion, including in evangelical religion, is too privileged, it's too entrenched and too comfortable, and it lacks the necessary courage and wisdom to fight against the great evils that are perverting America. Wow, what a powerful statement. Let me say it one more time. The establishment, both in politics and religion, including evangelicalism, is too privileged, too entrenched, too comfortable, and lacks the necessary wisdom and courage to fight against the great evils that are perverting America. He closes by saying, will you be the leader that God has called you to be in this way? Will you follow him wherever he leads and be a true disciple by looking to him along in what you say and do? If a holy remnant will now do that and exhort others to join them, we will see God's hand move in our time for his purpose. We will see God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And again, every time I hear some politician or whatever, spout out "God bless America" at the end of a speech and all, I tell you that's not my prayer. My prayer is God have mercy on America. We are the most blessed people who've ever lived, and only by God's grace will we continue to be blessed, but we need his mercy and forgiveness more than anything. Real quickly here, there's a, let me see here, there's a comment in the, yes,
One comment.
just real loudly if you can.
What you just said. Walls and Kamala are ending their stages with God bless America.
Are they? So Tim Walz and Kamala Harris in their speeches with God bless America. Okay. Well, real quickly, this will just take a minute. Dan Siegel has written that some real interesting features of Romans 13 may be clues to guide guide its ultimate interpretation. I have no qualifications to suggest a quote correct interpretation, but would point out that Paul doesn't simply present a scenario of the government and the believer. Instead, he brings in another element, and that is the element of morality, good and bad. Secondly, Dan says, the apostle specifically says that if we do good, we will receive the approval of the one in authority, but that he is an avenger to bring judgment on the wrongdoer. Well, that may not have applied to Caligula and Nero and so on, but no, I see the point you're making, Dan. Well, there are the cases of Joseph, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Paul himself and other apostles, various multitudes of Christian martyrs, and of course, our Lord himself. Were these evildoers? God forbid. Then why did not the relevant authorities smile upon them? Yeah. I mean, most of the rulers in human history have been evil, even in countries like Great Britain, for instance, probably the best country in all of history prior to the founding of the United States. Dan closes by saying this, in my view, goes straight to the question of whether Paul is really telling us what government does, or rather what government is supposed to do. Good insight, Dan, and I think you're quite right about that, and that is that government is supposed to promote justice.
And not lie.
And not lie, okay, yeah. But it normally fails in that regard. Well, wonderful being with you all this evening, and so we're going to break things off here real rapidly so we can drive almost 30 minutes home, and certainly don't want to miss the debate tonight. Let's be in prayer for this debate. This man, J.D. Vance, is a very, very impressive individual, a professing Christian, and somebody who has the kind of character and intellect that we need in positions of influence and power in our government. So let's do be in prayer for him, that all will go well in that debate. Okay. So blessings, good being with you all. Thank those of you who joined us online. Thank you as well. Great to see you.
Thank
Thank you.
you,
Thanks, Jeffrey.
Jeffrey.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.